Ensign Haley still wasn't sure if she should be flattered or insulted. She couldn't decide if Grotor was using her or not, and she wasn't altogether sure how little of the truth he was telling her. She also wasn't sure if she could ask him. "You're relieved of your duties," he had said to her in the privacy of his cabin. "I have a more important task for you." He'd explained to her how she would continue to sit at the same council that she'd sat at before, but he'd arranged for an ensign of off the bridge to handle her formal tasks, and then she'd be allowed to do what she was supposed to do. "And what's that?" she'd ask. "Why, draw, of course," he said. "Doodle and draw. Don't think about it much. Anything that comes to mind or have to mind. Just draw it and then vid it over to me." "You want me to spend my time doodling, sir?" He nodded. "You really don't have any idea, do you?" he asked. "Any idea of what, sir? You didn't recognize what you drew?" he asked. "No," she said, and then said, "Well, it looked like the unitologist symbol." "That's right," he said, "but it's much more than that. Can I share something with you?" he asked. She said, startled, but the hesitancy with which she'd responded had made him clam up again. "It's tied to our work on the planet," he had said. "What you're doing, Ensign Haley, is important work. It might not seem so, but it is. You'll have to take my word for it. We need to be careful who takes advantage of it." She had laughed. "You must be joking, sir," she had said, but apparently he was not, for here she was now sitting at her council, scribbling with her stylus on her digital pad. She had been doing it for more than a week now, and spinning each doodle over to Grotor. As soon as she felt she was ready to move on to a new page, Grotor's response had been impassive at first, then slowly he had begun to express his disappointment. "No," he finally said, "that's not it. That's not helping at all. Perhaps if you'd tell me what you'd like me to draw," she said, "then I could be of more help." He shook his head. "No," he said, "if it's to be of any use to us at all, it just has to come." But ever since primary school, she'd been trained to please, and she was incredibly frustrated that now somehow she couldn't. She tried a second guess what Grotor wanted. He'd been insanely pleased when she drew some version of the unitologist symbol, and so she drew it again, and so for the briefest moment a flicker of excitement when he saw it, but the excitement quickly faded. "Stop thinking," he scolded her. "Let it just come." "Let what just come?" "It might have gone on much longer like that, might have gone on just like that until the moment when Grotor, frustrated, gave up on Ensign Haley and returned her to her duties. But Grotor likely was not a man to become easily frustrated, and also luckily something happened first. Grotor would realize when he looked at the data later at the point in their loop where they were directly above the man-made facilities on Aspera's surface. They were also due to sloppy navigation on Ensign Arthur's part closer to the surface than they usually were, and finally instrumentation would reveal there had been a burst of energy from the planet's surface from the marker. Suddenly Haley had given a little cry and clutched her headache. He heard Arthur ask. Every time the man spoke, it filled Groter with irritation. It was partly because he knew the man was a plant from Blackwell, but in addition, the man was simply irritating. Even toying with that technician down on the surface, Wadri pretending not to remember his name didn't help much. It must have been a bad one. Ensign Haley had her head in her hands for 20 or 30 seconds and seemed a little dazed after. What was it, he wondered? Simply a migraine? Why had it seemed to come along so suddenly? He watched her for a while. For a few moments she was still, and then she picked back up her stylus and continued her task. Ensign Haley, he said. She raised her head, gave him a tired look. Yes, sir, she asked, her tone flat. Leave the bridge and take a few moments to gather yourself, he said. For a moment he thought she was going to protest as she had before, but instead she gave a curt nod, spun what she was on her pad over to his vid, and stood up to leave. She was halfway to the door when he realized what she'd sent him. Wait a moment, Haley, he said. She stopped and paused on the far side of the bridge, waiting while he took a closer look. A new series of equations, crystallization counter-sequences. The gray man had called one part of the first set or something similar, if not exactly that. He recognized a few of the equational gestures that he'd seen alongside the first sketch, but he didn't know enough to be able to judge how important or genuine they were. He would have to send them along, see what the gray man felt they amount to. The image alongside them didn't look at all like the marker, but there was a small, rough sketch of the marker lower on the page, and he realized that the rectangle he was seeing was a cut away, a cross section from the marker. Leave the bridge, Ensign Arthur, he said. What? Said Arthur. I'm not the one with the headaches, he said. Sir, said Groter flatly. What? Said Arthur. I'm not the one with the headache, sir, said Groter. Leave that's an order. Arthur stood, face livid with suppressed anger, but left. Now the rest of you, Groter said, all of you, except you, Ensign Haley. There was a moment of stunned silence, and then the bridge crew started up and cleared up, a dull rumbling going through them. It took them a few moments, but soon he was left alone with Ensign Haley. There was a long silence, which she finally broke. What am I supposed to do, sir? She asked. Do your task, he said. My task? Draw, he said. I want you to sit in that chair and draw until you can no longer see, and then I want you to keep drawing. Confused, she sat and began. Almost immediately it was clear that something was happening. She quickly entered an almost trance-like state, and what came pouring out was complex and strange equations and models, plans and structures. He had always known she was special, but he hadn't realized just how special. She drew for hours before it began to fade and just became ordinary doodles again. He was not disappointed with the results, and more importantly, neither was the gray man. Chapter 24. There was a static, a whispering when the burst came. It stayed with Istvan for more than a little while, even once the visions had begun to fade. And within it, if he listened hard enough, he could hear voices. They were incomplete and parallel, but they were voices. He was sure of it, or nearly sure, and they were not, as the other voices had been, merely a squashed repetition of words he had said himself. No, these were voices. Now all he had to do was train himself to listen hard enough so that he could hear them. He took to sitting in his cell on the edge of his bed, his feet flat on the floor, his hands on his knees, just listening. It reflect on the floor, his hands on his knees, just listening. It reminded him of sitting on the edge of his bed late at night when he was a boy and practicing blanking the world out. There were the general noises he could hear around him, and the sound of footsteps, the voices of the other inmates, a rustle or creak here or there, but these he tried to learn to unlist, to tune out completely and in a certain manner, and after a few days he succeeded. Then there was the sound of his heartbeat, the noise of his own breathing, the noises coming from his body and stomach. These two he learned to unlisten to, first dueling them and then reducing them to nothing at all. It came slowly and had to be redone every time he sat down again, but it could be done. And then once in that space of silence, he had to sharpen his ears. Still further, he had to not only make them listen to the rumble of whispering voices beneath everything, but to home in on just one of them, to pick it out, to start to hear its words. It took 6 days in which he hardly ate, hardly even moved. At first his fellow prisoners were worried about him and clustered around him, but after he ignored them for a few hours, they gave up, left him alone. Occasionally one of them would come back wandering, mostly, but wouldn't stay long. And though he found it an irritation to have someone shaking him, someone trying to talk to him, he quickly learned to ignore this as well. And then late in the 6th day, his ears caught hold of the tail of a voice and reeled it closer until he could hear it. It was incomplete and partial, but it was a real voice speaking its own words, starting to say something. He messaged it, caressed it until it grew a little, became a little louder, and he could hear that it was addressing him. Istvan, it was saying, "Why won't you talk to me?" "But I don't even know who you are," he said. His lips were moving, he knew, whispering the words, but he could feel the words being uttered in his head as well. "Ah, there you are," said the voice. "Now you hear me." "I've been trying to talk to you all along," he said. Istvan said, "and I've been trying to talk to you. It just took us a while to find the right tongues." Indeed, as they spoke, the voices became stronger, more confident. It stretched and scratched against the sides of his mind like an animal and slowly grew larger, and he knew that now that he'd be able to find it again, hear it again whenever he went searching for it. And late on the seventh day, when the burst came again, he felt less pain this time. It was as if his head had been filled with living thinking fire. The veil fell over things, tattered at first and then becoming blazing with light as it always did, and then even more quickly resolving into another colorful world. There was the face of Khan, his lips almost blue, his neck bloody. He hovered there just in front of him, staring. "Hello, Khan," Istvan said, and this time, instead of letting the face take his words and use them as his own, Istvan imagined the voice that he had been hearing drifting up from where, despite its growing size and power, it huddled and crouched in the background, and threading itself into the dead man's throat until Khan opened his mouth and spoke with it. "Hello," Khan said. The voice was strange, not quite properly synced with his lips, and he spoke with a wet burble as if his throat was still partly filled with blood. Air too hissed softly but out from the holes in his windpipe. "There," thought Istvan, "now we're getting somewhere."